ship is already moving when you see it. Gray water, gray sky, the hull pulling away from shore before the light has fully decided to arrive. You will enter 6 lives inside this world, a body that belongs to someone else by law. A man who owns his first acre of Norse soil and understands, the morning after, exactly what it costs to keep it. A warrior lord whose reputation is the only wall standing between him and irrelevance, and who knows the wall is made of other men's opinions. A jarl who receives a piece of information one afternoon. Nothing confirmed, just a meeting that happened. A herseer and a king's representative. A conversation nobody reported to him, and sits very still in his hall while he decides what it means. And a king who has not been on a ship in 3 years. Subscribe if you're new here. Leave a comment on which rank you would survive. This script moves through 6 levels of the Viking social hierarchy, from the thrall at the absolute bottom to the king at the top, across roughly 2 centuries of Norse life centered on the world of 9th and 10th century Scandinavia. Each level is defined not only by what it holds, but by what holding it requires. Between 10 and 30% of the Scandinavian population during the Viking Age were enslaved. That is not a footnote. That is the foundation the whole structure is built on. The ship is rounding the headland now. You are still on the shore. Not everyone watching it leave is watching it with hope. Not everyone watching it leave is watching it with hope. You wake before the household does. That is not a choice. The fire needs banking, the animals need moving, the water needs hauling from the stream before the family that owns you requires it for their morning. You are one of perhaps 1 in 5 people living in 9th century Scandinavia. Some estimates reach closer to 1 in 3 in the wealthiest coastal settlements, and you have no legal name under Norse law. Not in the sense that matters. You have a sound people use to get your attention. That is different. You were acquired on a ship. Most thralls were. The raids that the sagas celebrate as the Viking Age's defining act were, in practical terms, a labor acquisition system. Every longship that left a Norwegian or Danish fjord between roughly 800 and 1050 carried the possibility of returning with people as cargo. You might have been Irish. You might have been Frankish or Anglo-Saxon or Slavic. The eastern trade routes through what is now Russia funneled enslaved people from the steppes into Scandinavian markets as reliably as the western raids did. The slave markets at Hedeby and Burka processed human beings alongside amber furs and walrus ivory. You arrived at one of those markets. Someone paid for you. The transaction was recorded, and from that moment you had a price, but not a standing. Here is what Norse law said about your death. Nothing. A thrall who was killed owed no were-gild. No blood price, no compensation to a family, no legal consequence beyond property damage to your owner. Every free person in this world, from the lowest bondy farmer to the highest jarl, had a wergild. The amount told you exactly what that person's life was worth inside the legal structure of the community. Yours was 0, not small, not discounted, 0. The law did not note your absence because the law did not note your presence. You slept in the longhouse. So did the cattle, separated by a low partition. In Norwegian farmsteads of the period, the livestock section of the longhouse generated heat through the winter that kept the human section from freezing, which means that the practical logic of the arrangement was sound. This is not comfort. It is the mechanics of keeping a working body functional through a Norwegian winter. Your children, if you had them, were born into this same category. The father's status was irrelevant. A thrall's child was a thrall. That is not a social judgment. It is a property rule. The household's assets did not decrease because one asset reproduced. There was one exit, one legal path out of this rank. A master could grant manumission, freedom by declaration. It happened. Sagas record it. Thralls who served loyally for years, who demonstrated skills, who proved economically valuable in ways that exceeded raw labor, were sometimes freed. The word for what you became if that happened was leisingi, a freed thrall. It sounds like a rival. What it actually was is the subject of the next life in this world. And if you think leaving the longhouse meant leaving the chain, you have not yet understood what this system was built to do. The word leisingi sounds like a rival. It is not a rival. What it is the subject of the life you are entering now, and you will need to sit with it carefully because this rank is the one the system designed to feel like freedom while functioning as something else entirely. Here's what manumission actually transferred. Not ownership of yourself, not yet. The Norse legal framework recognized a spectrum between full thrall and full freeman, and the leisingi occupied its middle ground, legally acknowledged, socially suspended. What a master granted when he freed a thrall in 9th century Scandinavia was a category, not a condition. You now had a name the law would record. You did not yet have a voice the law would hear. The obligations ran in one direction, under the customs that governed freed thrall status across the Scandinavian world, documented most fully in the Gulathingslog, the law code of Western Norway compiled in written form around the 11th century, but reflecting practices 2 centuries older. A leisingi owed continued service to the freeing family for at least 1 generation. not as a thrall, as something harder to name, a dependent who was technically free to decline work and practically unable to afford the consequence of declining it. You might receive a small plot, an allotment of perhaps 2 to 5 acres on poorer land adjacent to the household that freed you, enough to grow barley and keep 2 or 3 animals through a Norwegian winter. It was not independence. It was a longer leash with a different detachment point. The thing was where this became visible. The thing, the Norse assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes, confirm laws, and render judgment, met seasonally across Scandinavia, from the local Herod assembly governing a single valley to the larger regional Althing drawing representatives from across a territory. A lay singi could attend. This was real. You could stand at the edge of the Thing field at Frostethingslag in the Trøndelag region and watch the proceedings. You could hear every argument made. What you could not do was stand and speak. That right, the formal right to address the assembly, to bring a grievance, to answer a charge in your own voice, was withheld until the second generation. Your child, born free, raised free, carrying none of the legal residue of the Thrall household, could speak at 25, where you could only listen at 45. This is the mechanism the system used to maintain its extraction logic across the transition from owned to freed. The first generation absorbs the cost of the liberation. They provide the labor that justified granting it. The second generation earns the standing. The third generation is, finally, indistinguishable from a Bondi born to free parents 3 generations back. The chain shortened by a link with each generation. It did not break, it shortened. What you owned as a Lasingi was your labor. What your labor owned was your obligation, the craft role that came with freedom. If you had demonstrated a skill worth monetizing, a family might free you specifically to run a smithy or manage a fishing operation on their behalf, generated income that you split along lines the freeing household determined. Archaeological evidence from trading sites at Kupang in the Vestfold region of Norway, excavated extensively between 1950 and 2003, suggests that freed craftsmen operated in semi-independent workshops adjacent to major farmsteads, their output tracked and tithed in ways that mirror tenant arrangements more than employee relationships. You were not a slave. You were not quite an independent operator. You were a margin. The psychological weight of this rank is specific. It is not the weight of the thrall's condition, the absolute legal silence, the zero weregild, the livestock partition in the longhouse. Those horrors have a clarity to them, however brutal. The Lasinga's burden is subtler, and in some ways harder. You are permitted to understand what you do not have. The thrall, who has never attended a thing, does not feel the specific humiliation of attending without a voice. You feel it. You can map precisely the distance between where you stand and where full legal personhood begins. You can count the years. You can watch your children and calculate which one of them will be the first in your line to stand and speak without permission. The saga's record freed thralls with names. That matters. Egil's saga, the Laxdæla saga, and Njal's saga, all drawing on events from the 9th and 10th centuries, committed to vellum primarily in the 13th, preserve Lasingi figures who act, choose, fail, and occasionally rise. One figure in Laxdæla saga, a freed slave named Melkorka, arrives as an Irish captive acquired at a slave market, is freed and given land, and eventually sees her son Olafur achieve full Hersir, standing through his father's Norwegian lineage. The saga treats her arc across roughly 40 years. Her freedom arrives in the text as a gift. What the text also shows, without editorializing, is that she cannot return to Ireland. She cannot reclaim the life she had before Hedeby. The freedom she receives is real. Its geography is fixed. You own your labor. The labor is still owed. And the land beneath your feet, this 2 to 5 acre plot, this First Norse soil that legally belongs to you, this thing that the thrall who woke before dawn every morning in that longhouse could not have imagined, is smaller than you thought it would be when you heard the word freedom. It is enough to survive on. It is not enough to stop owing. The man who owns the farm adjacent to yours, the Bondi who can vote at the thing and carry a weapon without permission and speak his name before the assembly without looking at the ground, understands something about this land that you are still learning. He does not own it the way you thought ownership worked either, but that is a different chain worn by a different man, and you are not yet in a position to compare. The king does not have a wound you can see. That is the first thing to understand about this rank. Harold Fairhair spent approximately 30 years in continuous military movement to consolidate Norway, from roughly 860 to 872 CE, and then again through the decades that followed, because consolidation is not a destination, it is a practice. By the time the sagas describe him in anything resembling stillness, he is already in the process of losing what stillness costs him. A king who stops moving stops being seen. A king who stops being seen stops being believed. In the Viking world, kingship was not a title that held itself up. It was a performance that required a live audience, and the audience was always measuring. What you own, at this rank, is the structure itself. The Jarl who sat in his hall, calculating what a private meeting meant, he was calculating with respect to you. The Herseer who counted his men the morning after a bad raid was counting toward you, or away from you, and the direction he chose had your name attached to it. The Bondi who answered the Lidanger call and left his farm during planting season did it because your summons carried legal consequence. The Lacingi who attended the thing without a voice attended a thing whose rules you, or your predecessors, ratified. The Thrall who woke before the household every morning and owned nothing, not even the sound people used to find them, they were at the bottom of a structure whose capstone is the word you use to introduce yourself. And the structure owns you in the way that only total possession can. You cannot leave it. A Thrall can be freed. A Lacingi can, across generations, become indistinguishable from anyone else. A Bondi can lose his farm and still be a man. A Herseer can lose his following and survive the loss, diminished but continuous. A Jarl can be displaced and remain, in some sense, himself. A king who loses his kingship does not become a private person. He becomes a claim that someone else is preparing to contest. The title does not release you. It converts you into a target and calls that conversion a crown. The ships are leaving again. You can see them from where you stand, which is the same shore, the same gray water, the same pre-dawn light that could not decide whether to arrive. The difference between the person who stood here in the opening of this story and the person standing here now is everything the ranks between them built and extracted and required. The Thrall on that shore had nothing and was watched by no one. You have everything and are watched by everyone, which means the shore is the same and the watching is the same, and the only thing the latter actually changed is the precise nature of what you cannot do. Somewhere in this kingdom this morning, a child is born into a Thrall household. That child has no legal name, no weregild, no voice at any assembly, no acre of Norse soil, no reputation to compound or collapse. That child cannot conceive of what it would mean to stand where you are standing. And you, standing here, watching the gray water take your ships beyond the headland, would not trade with that child, but you would not be able to explain, in terms that satisfied either of you, exactly why. The ship is already gone. The water has closed behind it. You are still on the shore.